Shields River Country, Montana, March 4th, 1843. While fellow trappers threw up their standard brush lean-tos and single-hide wickiups, 34-year-old Tom Hale was still working, wrapping his bent pole dome with two complete buffalo hides, inner layer hair side in, outer layer hair side out, maintaining a full 2-inch air gap between them. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Baptiste Laroche shook his head. Stupid trick, Hale. Save those robes for trading. Then March 8th arrived. 23 consecutive days of blowing snow, several nights plunging to 22 below zero. The killing storm that would test every shelter in the basin. Standard lean-tos collapsed under wind-packed snow. Single-wall wickiups dripped meltwater and never held heat. Trappers burned furniture, thick wood, just to stay alive. But Hale's stupid system maintained 34 degrees with no fire, 58 degrees with twigs, while his neighbors froze 10 feet from roaring flames. What did this Ohio farmhand understand about survival that seasoned mountain men had missed? Tom Hale had been riding hard for 3 days, pushing north from the Yellowstone with a light pack of prime beaver pelts and the satisfaction of a profitable late-season run. The 34-year-old Ohioan had learned to read weather signs during his 6 winters in the Rockies, and everything about this March afternoon spelled trouble. The barometer on his belt compass was dropping fast. The wind had shifted from west to east, and the sky carried that peculiar weight that meant serious snow. He had slept rough plenty of times, rolled in a buffalo robe under a brush lean-to with nothing but a good fire between him and whatever the mountains threw at him. It was the standard mountain man routine, proven by hundreds of trappers across thousands of cold nights. But something about this approaching storm felt different. The wind carried an edge that cut through wool and leather, and the temperature had already dropped 15 degrees since noon. Instead of throwing up the usual lean-to against the nearest cluster of pines, Hale dismounted in a small clearing and began cutting willow shoots. A wickiup would take longer to build, but the dome shape would shed wind that could flatten a lean-to. He selected 12 green poles, each 9 to 10 feet long, testing their flexibility with his hands before cutting. The saplings needed to bend without breaking, forming the skeletal frame that would support everything. As he worked, binding the poles into 3 circular hoops and cross-lashing them into a tight dome, Hale made a decision that would have seemed wasteful to any trapper watching. From his pack he pulled not 1 buffalo hide, but 2, both prime winter robes with thick, dense fur. Most men would have used a single hide stretched tight over the frame, hair side out to shed moisture, and called it sufficient. Hale had something else in mind. He lashed the first hide hair side in against the interior frame, creating a warm, comfortable inner wall. Then came the unconventional part. Instead of stopping there, he rigged a second hide hair side out over the first, using willow spacers and rawhide thongs to maintain a precise 2-inch gap between the layers. It was painstaking work, requiring careful measurement and adjustment to ensure the airspace remained uniform around the entire dome. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his concentration. Nate Purvis and Eli Greeley rode into the clearing with Baptiste Laroche, the French Métis hunter whose connections to the big trading companies made him something of an authority on practical matters. All 3 men pulled up short when they saw Hale's elaborate construction project. "You're fixin' to sleep in a robe barn," Nate called out, shaking his head with amusement. He was already eyeing a spot for his own shelter, a simple brush wickiup that would take half the time and use half the materials. Eli was less diplomatic. 8 robes on a dog hut? Wasteful and dumb. Hair goes out if you aim to stay dry, hair goes in if you aim to be warm. Pick one. Hale. Baptiste, whose opinion carried weight because of his reputation for surviving brutal northern winters, was equally skeptical. "Stupid trick, Hale. Save those robes for trading. You'll get more warmth selling them for blankets and whiskey than sleeping under them." Hale continued working as he answered, adjusting the outer hide's tension to maintain that crucial air gap. "I aim for both, warmth from the inner fur, snow shedding from the outer hair, and still air between the 2 layers. That trapped air will hold heat better than any fire." The 3 men exchanged glances. Eli snorted. "You'll burn the same wood anyhow." probably more, trying to heat all that dead space. As they prepared to ride on, Baptiste delivered his final assessment. "Mark my words, Hale, come spring, you'll remember this as the night you learned why the old ways work. 2 centuries of trappers can't all be wrong." But Tom Hale had spent his youth on an Ohio farm, building root cellars and insulating corn cribs against winter cold. He understood something about still air that his fellow trappers, for all their mountain wisdom, had never considered. As the first snowflakes began to fall and the wind picked up, he continued his methodical work, convinced that his wasteful preparation would prove itself when the storm truly arrived. With darkness settling and the snow beginning in earnest, Hale worked by feel as much as sight to complete his shelter. The urgency of the approaching storm made him rush the final attachment of the first hide, pulling the rawhide lashings tight against the pole framework until the buffalo skin molded directly to the bent saplings. It seemed like the logical approach, a snug fit that would eliminate gaps and drafts. Within the first hour of light flurries, he discovered his error. As he settled inside to test the warmth, his breath began hitting the cold inner surface of the hide, and condensation beads formed immediately where the skin contacted the poles. The moisture had nowhere to go, trapped between his body heat and the chilled exterior surface. Worse, he could feel cold radiating through every point where the hide touched the framework. His carefully planned insulation layer was conducting heat directly to the outside air through dozens of contact points. The problem was fundamental. By cinching the first hide tight to the poles, he had eliminated the very airspace that was supposed to provide insulation. The inner and outer covers needed to be completely decoupled, floating free of each other with that crucial 2-inch gap maintained uniformly around the entire structure. As melt began dripping on his knuckles from the condensation above, Hale knew he had to start over. Working in the growing darkness with snow now falling steadily, he cut 6 willow spacers for each hoop, thumb-thick pieces exactly 2 inches long that would act as standoffs between the layers. The work required precision. Each spacer had to be positioned to maintain uniform separation without creating pressure points that would compress the airspace. He toggled them carefully between the hides, then rigged a complex system of cross-lacing using thin rawhide thongs. The cross-lacing was the key innovation. Instead of attaching the outer cover directly to the frame, the rawhide thongs suspended it from anchor points on the inner layer, creating a floating shell that maintained its distance from the interior surface. Every connection had to be calculated to preserve that vital air gap while still providing structural integrity against wind loads. With the mechanical problem solved, Hale turned to orientation and weatherproofing. He flipped the inner layer so the hair faced inward, providing warmth and comfort against his body, while the outer layer was positioned hair side out to shed snow and ice. The seams where hide sections joined required careful attention. He overlapped them 4 to 6 inches in a shingle pattern, ensuring that wind and driven snow would hit overlapping surfaces rather than gaps. At the crown of the dome, he installed a small smoke flap that could be adjusted from inside using a long stick. Too large an opening would dump heat and invite downdrafts. Too small would trap smoke and create a choking environment. The flap needed to be controllable, allowing him to fine-tune the draft based on wind conditions and fire size. The floor system demanded equal attention to detail. He laid a foundation of willow withes in a tight weave, creating a barrier against ground moisture and cold. Over this went a deep layer of sage and pine boughs, 6 inches thick and carefully arranged to provide both insulation and cushioning. Finally, he spread one of his remaining buffalo robes fur side up, creating a comfortable sleeping surface elevated above the frozen earth. The entrance required its own engineering solution. A single door flap would either seal completely, trapping smoke and moisture, or hang open, allowing heat to pour out. Hale rigged a double flap system, an inner flap that could close while he worked the outer one, creating an airlock that maintained interior temperature while allowing entry and exit. As full darkness fell and the storm intensified, Hale settled into his corrected shelter to test its performance. He deliberately built no fire for the initial trial, wanting to measure the insulation value of the double wall system alone. Within an hour, The interior temperature had stabilized at several degrees above freezing, a remarkable achievement considering the outside air was dropping towards zero. More telling was what he could observe about heat transfer. His breath no longer condensed on interior surfaces, and the inner buffalo hide remained warm to the touch. Outside, he could see frost forming on the outer hair layer, exactly what he wanted. The system was working as designed, with the air gap successfully blocking heat transfer from the warm interior to the cold exterior. When he did light a small fire of pencil-thick twigs, the temperature climbed steadily to a comfortable level without the massive wood consumption that plagued open shelters. The double wall system was capturing and holding heat with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible to his fellow trappers, now struggling in their conventional shelters as the storm built toward what would become a 23-day siege. By the second day of construction, word of Hale's unusual shelter had spread throughout the scattered camps, along the creek bottoms and up into the basin. Trappers and freighters who normally kept to their own affairs found excuses to ride past and observe the peculiar double-walled dome taking shape in the clearing. The sight of 8 prime buffalo robes being used for a single shelter sparked heated discussions around every campfire within 5 miles. Baptiste Laroche made a point of stopping by twice, each time shaking his head with greater emphasis. "A robe for walls, another for the wind," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "You'll starve bartering come spring? Mark it down, Hale's lost his sense over this contraption." But not everyone shared Baptiste's dismissal. Mary Whitcomb, whose freight wagon sat immobilized by a broken axle while her husband searched for replacement parts, studied the construction with practical interest. She had spent enough seasons on the trail to recognize sound engineering when she saw it, regardless of how unconventional it appeared. Without ceremony, she arrived at Hale's camp with a coil of spare sinew lacing, the finest cordage available for the precise work his suspension system required. "Makes sense to me," she said simply, watching him adjust the tension on his cross-lacing. "2 walls with air between, same principle my grandmother used with quilts back in Pennsylvania." Old Crow Jack provided the most valuable input. The half-season scout had learned lodge construction from Apsaluk relatives during his years along the Yellowstone and Bighorn rivers, and he understood the physics of conical shelters better than any white man in the territory. He spent an entire afternoon examining Hale's rigging system, testing the flexibility of the spacers and checking the uniformity of the air gap. "Liner logic," he confirmed with a nod of approval. Crow lodges used the same principle, inner skin warm against the body, outer skin shedding weather, air moving up between them to carry smoke and moisture. His one piece of advice was critical. Keep that smoke opening small and make sure you can adjust it. Wrong-sized hole will either choke you with smoke or dump all your heat to the sky. Hugh McKendrick remained skeptical but helpful, loaning Hale an iron pot for more efficient cooking while warning that the tight crown design would smoke him like jerky. McKendrick represented the cautious middle ground, unwilling to embrace the innovation, but curious enough to see how it performed. As Hale put finishing touches on his shelter, the other trappers completed their own preparations using time-tested methods. His final structure measured 10 feet in diameter and rose 6.5 to 7 feet at the crown, large enough to stand upright at the center but compact enough to heat efficiently. He had used 8 to 10 winter robes total, positioning the heaviest bull hides on the windward side where they would bear the brunt of driven snow, while lighter cow hides covered the lee side. Nate Purvis worked with characteristic efficiency, throwing up a standard brush wickiup in a single day. His 9-foot circle used a foundation of willow and grass mats covered by 2 elk hides, exactly the shelter design that had served mountain men reliably for decades. The construction required no exotic materials or complicated rigging, just proven techniques and honest labor. Eli Greeley chose an even simpler approach, scraping out a snow trench and backing it with a lean-to of brush and a single buffalo robe. His design prioritized speed and minimal material use, reflecting the frontier philosophy that a man should travel light and make do with whatever the country provided. John Miller opted for a conical pole shelter, lashing saplings together at the top and covering the 8-foot frame with 4 deer hides positioned hair side out. He left the smoke hole wide open, trusting in aggressive fire management rather than sophisticated ventilation control. As evening settled and the snow continued falling, the camps engaged in spirited debate about shelter philosophy. Baptiste urged Hale one final time to strip off the second skin and save it for trade, while Mary countered that plenty of tribes used liner systems, and there was no shame in borrowing proven techniques from any source. Old Crow Jack weighed in with technical details about draft patterns and smoke behavior, explaining how proper air movement could keep a shelter suite even in still weather. Hale listened to the arguments while making final adjustments to his reflector stone and hearth ring, but his position remained unchanged. March storms in the high country brought unique challenges: ice buildup that could seal single walls solid, wind-driven spindrift that defeated thin covers, and sustained cold that demanded maximum fuel efficiency. The air gap wasn't luxury, he insisted, but necessity. When wood ran low and temperatures plunged, that trapped air layer would become his only reliable source of heat, more valuable than any amount of additional fuel he could possibly gather and stockpile. March 8th arrived with deceptive calm, but by evening the wind had shifted to a steady northwestern flow that carried the bite of Arctic air. What began as ordinary snowfall transformed overnight into something far more dangerous: a sustained blizzard driven by winds that would gust to 40 miles per hour for 23 consecutive days. The temperature plummeted to 22 degrees below zero on the worst nights, turning the entire basin into a frozen wasteland where survival depended entirely on the quality of each man's shelter. John Miller was the first to discover the fatal flaws in conventional design. His conical pole shelter had seemed adequate during construction, but wet snow driven at high velocity packed against the deer hides with crushing weight. The wide-open smoke hole that had promised good draft became a funnel for wind and moisture, allowing ice to form around the opening until smoke could no longer escape. Within 48 hours, choking fumes forced him to abandon the shelter entirely, leaving him to crouch beside a miserable fire that consumed enormous quantities of wood while providing minimal warmth in the driving wind. Eli Greeley's trench shelter failed in a different but equally decisive manner. The depression that had seemed like protection from wind became a trap for spindrift, fine, powdery snow that filled every void and crevice with relentless efficiency. His single buffalo robe, stretched tight over the brush framework, collected moisture from his breath and body heat, then froze solid as the temperature dropped. He spent the first week stamping his feet and beating his arms to maintain circulation, burning through his wood supply at an unsustainable rate until Baptiste Laroche grudgingly made room for him under a freight tarp windbreak. Nate Purvis experienced the slow torture of a shelter that almost worked. His brush wickiup maintained its basic structure against the wind, but everywhere the elk hides contacted the pole framework, heat conducted directly to the outside air. These contact points became condensation zones where moisture froze and dripped, creating a constant rain of ice water that soaked his bedding and clothing. The shelter never achieved stable temperature, remaining just a few degrees above freezing even when he fed a roaring fire that consumed 3 times the wood that should have been necessary. Inside Hale's double-walled dome, conditions told a completely different story. The sustained winds that destroyed other shelters actually improved his system's performance by creating a consistent pressure differential across the outer skin. This pressure helped maintain the crucial air gap, while the continuous air movement over the outer surface carried away moisture before it could accumulate as dangerous ice buildup. The hair outward orientation of the exterior hide allowed snow to slide off in sheets rather than building up in heavy, destructive layers. Most remarkable was the shelter's thermal performance. Without any fire at all, the interior temperature stabilized at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, a 56-degree improvement over the outside air during the coldest periods. This meant that even if Hale's fuel supply ran completely out, he could survive indefinitely in conditions that would kill a man in an uninsulated shelter within hours. When he did light fires, they were modest affairs of pencil-thick twigs and split kindling that raised the interior temperature to a comfortable 58 degrees. His fuel consumption told the most compelling story of efficiency. While Miller and Purvis burned through 3 to 4 times their anticipated wood supplies just to maintain marginal warmth, Hale's daily requirement held steady at 15 to 20 pounds of small wood. The double wall system captured and recycled heat so effectively that branches other men would have discarded as too small provided adequate warmth for sleeping and cooking. By the second week of the storm, the superiority of Hale's design became undeniable even to the most skeptical observers. His bent pole frame, locked into 3 hoops and cross-lashed with rawhide, showed no signs of stress or deformation despite constant buffeting by winds that had flattened less robust structures. The outer buffalo hide grid continued to shed snow loads automatically, while single-wall shelters accumulated crushing weights that eventually collapsed their frameworks or tore their coverings. The storm's persistence tested not just immediate survival, but long-term endurance. Men who might have weathered a 3-day blow using brute force and massive fires found themselves running out of accessible fuel as the storm stretched into its 3rd week. Deadfall within reasonable gathering distance disappeared quickly, forcing desperate individuals to venture into the blizzard seeking burnable material. Several trappers began burning personal gear, saddles, pack frames, anything combustible, in increasingly futile attempts to maintain life-sustaining warmth. When the storm finally exhausted itself near the end of March, the human cost became clear. 2 men from distant camps had died of exposure, their bodies discovered weeks later when the snow finally melted enough to permit search parties. Several others bore permanent damage from frostbite, lost fingers and toes that would mark them for the rest of their lives as survivors of the Great Blow of 1843. Tom Hale emerged from his double-walled shelter rested, well-fed, and equipped with all his original gear intact. His wasteful use of buffalo robes had proved to be the most economical investment any man in the basin had made that winter. When the trails reopened in early April, Nate Purvis was the first visitor to Hale's camp. The man who had mocked the double-walled design now arrived with a bundle of fresh-cut willow poles and a request for instruction. His pride had been thoroughly broken by 3 weeks of shivering in a shelter that consumed massive amounts of fuel while barely maintaining survivable temperatures. Mary Whitcomb followed close behind, bringing her broken freight wagon to a deliberate stop near Hale's clearing. She had questions about the spacer toggles and the precise method of suspending the outer hide without crushing the insulating air layer. Her practical mind grasped immediately that the technique represented more than wilderness survival. It was engineering knowledge that could transform how people built emergency shelters across the entire frontier. Hale's instruction was characteristically blunt and specific. 2 inches of quiet air all the way around, he told each visitor. Not 1 inch, not 3 inches, exactly 2. Inner hair to the man for warmth, outer hair to the weather for shedding, seams lapped tight, crown opening small enough to control with a stick, smoke guided up through the gap, not dumped into your face. Hugh McKendrick arrived with green poles already cut to length, ready to learn the hanging system that had baffled him during construction. He watched intently as Hale demonstrated the cross-lacing technique, showing how rawhide thongs could suspend the outer cover at uniform distance from the inner layer without creating pressure points that would compress the airspace. The key was tension distribution. No single attachment point could bear enough load to pull the layers together. As spring advanced into summer, the story spread through the interconnected networks that bound the Mountain West together. Freighters carried the tale from the Shields River country down to the Yellowstone, across to the Gallatin, and eventually into the Snake and Bear River territories. The account grew more detailed with each telling, but the core technical information remained accurate. Double walls, controlled air gap, proper ventilation, fuel efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. Word reached the formal literature within a few years. Captain Randolph B. Marcy's Overland Handbook, published in the late 1850s, endorsed conical bivouacs as superior to lean-to shelters for wind protection, though Marcy stopped short of describing the double-wall technique in detail. Other military and civilian guides began incorporating references to improved lodge construction and Indian methods adapted for frontier use, reflecting a growing awareness that traditional knowledge often surpassed conventional frontier wisdom. By the winter of 1844, an estimated 40 to 50 trappers and freighters in the Greater Yellowstone Corridor had adopted some version of the double-hide wickiup for emergency use. The method spread particularly quickly among mixed camps, where native and non-native trappers shared techniques freely, creating a cross-cultural exchange that validated indigenous building science through practical results. The transformation was most dramatic along the major freight routes. Wagon bosses who had traditionally relied on canvas tarps and half-faced camps for emergency shelter began requiring their crews to carry materials for double-walled domes. The additional weight and complexity seemed wasteful until men experienced the comfort and fuel efficiency firsthand. Within 2 seasons, the air gap principle had become standard emergency protocol for organized freight operations throughout the Northern Rockies. Modern documentation confirms the lasting impact of Hale's innovation. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Colorado Wickiup Project have cataloged hundreds of timber lodge sites across the Central Rockies, demonstrating that conical frame shelters were widespread throughout the region, both before and after the trapping era. The geographic distribution matches precisely the territory where Hale's techniques spread through word-of-mouth networks in the 1840s and 50s. Contemporary building science provides the theoretical framework that explains why Hale's empirical discoveries worked so effectively. Engineers now quantify insulation values in terms of R ratings, and they understand that still air represents one of the most effective barriers to heat transfer available in nature. A properly maintained 2-inch air gap can provide insulation equivalent to several inches of modern synthetic materials, confirming through laboratory measurement what Hale proved through winter survival. Modern expedition equipment validates the same principles through different materials. Double wall tents used by mountaineers and polar explorers rely on identical physics, a breathable inner canopy separated from a weatherproof outer shell by controlled airspace. The gap prevents condensation while maximizing thermal efficiency, allowing modern adventurers to survive extreme conditions with minimal fuel consumption. Plains tippy manufacturers and instructors continue to teach the liner and ozone system that Old Crow Jack had recognized in Hale's design. The liner creates an updraft between inner and outer skins that manages both smoke and moisture while providing superior insulation. These traditional techniques, preserved through continuous cultural transmission, demonstrate that Hale's innovation was actually the rediscovery of engineering principles that indigenous peoples had perfected over centuries. The Ohio farmhand's contribution was not the invention of double wall construction, but rather its successful adaptation to frontier conditions and its introduction to a community of trappers who had overlooked the technique's potential. His willingness to appear wasteful and foolish in order to achieve superior results became a case study in how practical innovation spreads through networks of practitioners who value performance over convention.